You still suck with Tzeentch. Admit it. Please, if you admit it now, I'll be your friend. And today I'm going to tell you why. Are you not the winged warlord you thought you were? Do your Kairos campaigns leave you feeling short-changed? Well, don't worry. Your twisted British self, Kairos Fateweaver, is here to look after you. And today we'll be diving deep into why you still suck with Tzeentch, Kairos Fateweaver, and the Oracles of Tzeentch as a faction. All the way back in May of 2023, I made this Why You Suck with Tzeentch video, and unfortunately it's really fallen on hard times. There's been a fair few updates, changes, and things that I just missed in the first video which didn't make it in. So, in the same way that Kairos bickers with his former self, I too share that trait. So, the Fateweaver of the present will assert his indomitable will upon his former self's transgressions. My name is Blake, and I bid you my fondest welcome to Blake's Takes, where today I'm going to give you my take on why you're still awful with Tzeentch. Is my take hot or not? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoy today's video, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel out. Now, get back here, past self. I'm not done with you. Chapter 1. Saving Private Sarthoreal. Sarthoreal, the big bad of Total War Warhammer 1, lies directly north of you in Warhammer 3, and you can see him right away, but blink and you'll miss him. By turn 3, he will be destroyed by Teclis and his brood of High Elves, but fear not. Follow this guide to the letter and you can save Sarthoreal and confederate him into your faction. Be advised that this is a scheme so infinite in its complexity that you are effectively peering into the Well of Eternity itself. Deviate from these steps and Sarthoreal will be lost to you forever. Attack the starting Nurgle faction's army. Fight this battle manually and ensure you take as few casualties as possible. Use your Knights, Furies and Kairos himself to distract the enemy as they make their way up to your horror firing lines. Be precise and make sure the enemy doesn't reach you. Cycle charge your Knights into any Nurgle units that get close, or drop Kairos in there as a distraction. He won't do much damage because he's blind to the present, but he can take a fair few punches, so don't be shy about using him. Now attack the Lost Palace and sack that settlement. Do not occupy it. Once you've sacked the settlement, use your remaining movement points to put him in channeling stance to generate more winds of magic, and move Kairos as far south as he will go. Now use the Scriveners of Insanity Unholy Manifestation to get yourself some more grimoires. Now open up the Diplomacy menu, and give Sarthoreal's faction a generous gift. Then follow it up with a medium gift to boost your relationship with him.
Enjoy the money, I hope it makes you very happy.
Now end your turn. Turn 2, you'll notice that Teclis has taken Dawn's Light. This means Sarthoreal only has one settlement remaining before he dies. So attack the Lost Palace again and then sack it again. Now move your army as far away as possible to Volultrax. Ensure that Kairos is not in the Lost Palace province. You don't want to get any trespassing penalties for what comes next. Now open up your Changing of the Ways screen and swap the Lost Palace over to Sarthoreal's Watchers. This will keep them alive over the next turn. When you start your next turn, attack Volultrax, sack Volultrax, then occupy the settlement. Then you want to sell Volultrax to Sarthoreal for a nice chunk of change. This will boost up Sarthoreal's relationship a lot. Now, this part here sounds counterintuitive, as all of Tzeentch's deceptions are, but then you need to declare war on Sarthoreal. Yes, you heard that right. Declare war on him. Sarthoreal at this point will have been wiped out by Teclis, and he has no forces to defend his newly acquired territory, so he will immediately accept a peace offering and will pay you for the privilege of doing this. After peace has been made, this will further boost his relations. He will realise that the jig is up and allow you to confederate him. Sarthoreal is a legendary lord and allows you to cast spells at a greater range than you normally would. He's a Law of Metal caster, which isn't ideal, but he's still a formidable legendary lord. He's a solid melee competent, so can jump into fights handily enough. He's also a siege attacker, so your next army with him at the helm will be able to immediately launch the attack in sieges. Follow these steps and enjoy your new legendary lord. At first, I went down a rabbit hole of trying to vassalize Sarthoreal. To save him, I traded his vassalization for an early declaration of war on Teclis, and that might be able to work, but it absolutely crumpled my campaign's tempo. I ended up not being able to finish off my Nurgle punching bag enemy because of this, and it was all just a big mess. A true brain rot moment that showed off just how far my brain had atrophied after my TikTok and niche pornography binges.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're very welcome, friend. For this section, I just want to credit fellow YouTuber and another one of the Dark Lords of Australian Total War content creation, Mercy the Mad, who dug me out of this vassalization hole with this excellent video on this very subject. So be sure to check out his channel for very specific tips on how to get the most out of your campaigns. If you have an issue in one of your campaigns, chances are he has the cure to what ails you. There's a link to his channel and the video I got this walkthrough from in the description below. Now, Teclis will not be happy with all this gift giving and confederating, so that brings me nicely on to Chapter 2, Tangling with Teclis. Now, in my original guide, I allowed Sarthoreal to his fate, blissfully unaware of his predicament, and I went after the Slaaneshi faction to the east. A lot of commenters on the original video made me aware of poor Sarthoreal, so now invading Slaaneshi lands is not the priority. With all that diplomacy you've been doing with your avian cousin, Teclis will be seething at your mere existence, so he is now the priority war target. You have to act fast as well, because you have other issues coming from the west which will inevitably come and bite you in your feathered arse. So what makes Teclis such a fiend to deal with? Well, on the harder difficulties, he will have nearly 2 full armies by the time you can barely afford 1. His troops will also be of far higher quality than yours. His archers outrange your horrors substantially, his spearmen will beat your horrors in melee, and he has a frost phoenix which will come in and ruin your day. So how do I assault this impossible fortress of an enemy this early on? By the way, that's a reference to a place in Tzeentch's realm for any of the people who might have sex in my audience. Well, the key is you need to be the aggressor. You need to attack his forces, not the other way around. This is one of those rare occasions where a tip that I give isn't just isolated to a certain faction. This is globally useful. Be the aggressor. The reason for this is AI behavior. If you're the aggressor, the AI will hold a defensive formation, allowing you to pick apart their forces. If they attack your army, they will advance on you, and this will become an awful lot harder, as you won't be able to grab certain units' attentions, and this is exactly what we're going to be doing with Teclis' feathered Frostfire Phoenix, who has betrayed all of birdkind by siding with him. Get Kairos over to drop a few blue fires of Tzeentch on the Phoenix, and you can goad that unit into trying to chase after Kairos. Now, Kairos is as useful as a marzipan dildo in melee, but that's fine. His uselessness in fisticuffs is exactly what will set the Phoenix onto pursuing him ahead of the rest of his army. He can lure the Phoenix back to your horror firing lines for a warm welcome. The Exalted Flamer is also a dab hand at taking out single entities, so make sure to use him as well. Once the Phoenix is dead, you've now got some other heavy hitters in the High Elf roster to deal with. Teclis will have some Sword Masters of Hoeth and a Lion Chariot. Hit the Lion Chariot with blue fires of Tzeentch, and hit the Sword Masters with Infernal Gateway if you have it unlocked, or a few overcast pink fires of Tzeentch. You will likely need to wait for the Spearmen to bunch up on your horror lines to clear out most of his forces. Spells like the Burning Head from your Cultist are great for clearing out these masses of infantry. Hide your knights so they can threaten his backline, and use your Furies and Sarthoreal to tie up archers to stop them from pouring more damage into your horrors. It's a painful fight, no doubt, but winnable. Make sure you're the aggressor so you can isolate that Phoenix of his. Also, this shitty little Skaven faction decided to declare war on me as well. It's fine, just ignore them. You need to kill Teclis. Once you've taken out Teclis' main force, beeline for the rest of his settlements and get them wiped out. Do not engage any other enemies until this is done, as Teclis can bounce back with resplendent force against you. Chapter 3, The Oxyotyl Onslaught.
In the first age, in the first battle, when the shadows first lengthened, one stood. He chose the path of perpetual torment. In his ravenous hatred, he found no peace, and with boiling blood, he scoured the umbral plains, seeking vengeance against the Dark Lords who had wronged him. And those that tasted the bite of his sword named him the Doomslayer.
After you've wiped out Teclis, Oxyotyl, the Doomslayer, will take notice and want you dead. He will have been pulverizing the Chaos factions west of you into a fine Tzeentchian mist, and will have his sights set on you. At this point in the campaign, you will likely be able to confederate whatever is left of the flaming scribes to the west of you. Take the Confederation and get your armies back to defend your newly acquired turf. Set up one of your lords in an ambush position outside of the Demon's Gate, and let Oxyotyl come to you. I managed to get rid of his 2 starting armies with this, utilising the garrison forces for extra balance of power, giving me 2 pretty straightforward auto-resolves. Now, this is another tip which will help you in all of your campaigns, and that's the aggressiveness of AI factions. Factions that are commanded by a legendary lord are typically far more aggressive than a faction that isn't, so you have to prioritise getting rid of legendary lord factions over factions led by a generic counterpart. You can see that Zlatan here has declared war on me, shortly after Oxyotyl had. I don't try and split up my forces to defend on 2 fronts. I purposefully take both Kairos and Sarthoreal over to Oxyotyl to deal with him. I leave the territory to Zlatan because I know that they will likely only take a couple of territories off me, and I can always sail back and deal with them afterwards. Legendary Lord factions such as the Ghosts of Parhux are far more of a threat than Zlatan will ever be. They recruit far more armies with far more dangerous troops, and their AI is programmed to be more aggressive in taking territory. It's always better to concentrate your forces onto one enemy at a time, especially when there is a legendary lord leading the enemy faction. Despite me taking out their starting armies very quickly, I was very surprised to see another 2.5 stacks coming up to my front lines, just a few turns after their series of ambush defeats. So much so, I had to retreat Kairos back here to join back with Sarthoreal. I felt like I was the president of Haiti, who was also surprised by the size of a thing.
Le respect.
This goes to show that if I had decided to stay and split my forces and defend my Teclis gains too, I would have likely ended up in a stalemate. Losing a bit of territory is not going to hold you back as much as a war on multiple fronts. Your campaigns will progress much more smoothly if you concentrate your forces onto your most dangerous enemy, one at a time, even if that means sacrificing a bit of territory. At turn 30, when Oxyotyl was finally dead, notice that Zlatan has only taken 2 settlements off of me over the course of the war with Oxyotyl. Now onto the actual battles themselves. It's always tricky fighting lizards. A key advantage you have is your reinforcements will arrive 50% faster than theirs, so make sure you're using this advantage by concentrating your forces as I've just explained to you. In the actual battles themselves, Sarthoreal's Golden Hounds are a great tool for dropping on lizard forces as they make their approach to you. Pink Fires from Kairos are excellent for getting rid of skinks. An overcast Pink Fire of Tzeentch, correctly placed, will basically delete a skink unit, so bear this in mind. Then, when the lizards are bunched around your troops, hit them with big spells like Infernal Gateway. The final transmutation is great for getting rid of single entity units and heroes. Remember to use the terrain to your advantage. Note I've nestled my forces next to this impassable rock face so the lizards can't flank me. This keeps them right where I want them for the big area of effect spells, and so my horror firing lines can keep flinging fireballs at them. Now, one final tip is to try and pick up Oxyotyl's defeat trait on both Kairos and Sarthoreal. Vanguard deployment for Tzeentchian Lords is excellent because it means you can start whittling down the enemies with spells a lot faster than you normally would. Chapter 4. Soothing Lord Skrolk. Now, Lord Skrolk was also at war with the ghosts of Pohax, so I managed to get some small diplomatic bonuses with him on that front. If he's doing well in his campaign, it's always worth trying to appease him than getting into a fight with him. The reason for this is your campaign objectives are not in the Lustrian jungle. You need to go and deal with Krokkar, Teclis and Zlatan. For long campaign objectives, you need to go and take care of Kugath. To satisfy the long victory campaign objectives, you need to focus on the Eastern Front, not the Western Front. That's why I heartily recommend soothing Lord Skrolk to facilitate this. Clan Pestilens often do quite well, and they manage to get rid of a fair chunk of the Order factions on the southern tip of Lustria. As soon as Oxyotyl was dead and the land secured, I immediately went to work boosting up diplomatic relations with Skrolk to avoid getting stuck into a war on two fronts. Offer him a small amount of money, or in my case, because I was a broke boy, I offered to hop into wars with the factions he was fighting. I had no intention of actually helping him in those wars, but you need to try and secure a non-aggression pact with him, if possible, to keep him chilled. With that done, you can now turn your attention back to the hordes of lizardmen which will be invading Teclis' former turf. Chapter 5. Blue Fire Blues.
Let me through! Let me through! Let me through! That's my son! That's my boy! My boy! No!
Blue Fire of Tzeentch is a very different animal to what it was when it first came out. In my first video, I stated it was basically anti-everything, and it was, but that status has long since passed. Whilst Blue Fire can still be spammed aggressively with prismatic plurality, it's certainly not the powerhouse it once was. You see, the Blue Fire attack pattern has changed, so that it now erupts around you, and mid-range shots will be very, very inaccurate. Most of the bolts will miss. The bolts also lack the penetration they once had, so now the bolts will be far less effective at dealing with massed infantry. Pink Fire of Tzeentch, specifically an overcast Pink Fire, is now your anti-infantry solution for anything not sporting a lot of armour. For anything sporting a lot of armour, or has flame resistance like the Chaos Dwarves, you're going to have to drop an Infernal Gateway on them for any serious damage. Blue Fire is very good at taking down single entities or whittling down flyers from range, but it's nowhere near as potent as it once was when I made my initial Why You Suck with Tzeentch video. It's still spammable, but you don't want to be mid-range anymore to take on characters. You always want to be at max range. This allows the bolts to converge and home in on their enemies. Interestingly though, it can still be quite effective whilst the caster is in melee. I've had Kairos spam it against other flyers that are attacking him to good effect, but it's always best to be at long range for the bolts to seek out their targets most effectively. Chapter 6. Troop Travesties. There are some absolute travesties going on with the Tzeentch faction and their units in the current state of the game. Chaos Warriors with halberds as an example require a tier 4 building, despite being tier 2 units in terms of value. Is a Chaos Warrior with halberd really going to have the same effect as an Arachnarok Spider for the greenskins? Well, you tell me. I don't mind that factions don't have parity across their rosters, it's what makes this game so fun, but maybe they can drop them down to a tier 3 building with their sword-wielding counterparts. That would be nice. In the early game, I think a mass horror approach is your most viable tactic. But unfortunately, your best horrors, exalted pink horrors, take 2 turns to recruit, which is very unfortunate. They just take too long to recruit to be viable until you're basically in the late game, dicking around. In the late game, the global recruitment time for a standard pink horror can be brought down to just a single turn, whilst exalted pinks will take 4 turns. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Changebringers, a tier 4 unit which will undoubtedly bring far more battlefield impact, only take 1 turn to recruit, and as such, they're a staple. But Exalted Pink Horrors can only really be utilised when you have a lot of breathing room, and even then, I certainly don't think the extra time spent recruiting is worth it for the performance of that unit. Speaking of Changebringers, they certainly feel a lot more fragile than they were at the launch of Shadows of Change, and they were pretty fragile then, so you have to be really careful with them. Anything which has long range and accurate artillery will devastate them if you don't keep your constant attention on them. Things like the Tomb King Bone Giant or Lizardmen's Stegodons will carve right through the barrier and take out multiple models with a single shot. If you've brought them and you see that the enemy has fielded some of these dangerous artillery units, leave them at the back of your formations out of range. They really shine against melee focused armies like Khorne or Nurgle. They're basically anti-everything as long as they can shoot at them. If the enemy is a ranged focus faction, then that might be quite difficult to accomplish. Their ground-based counterparts, the Flamers and Exalted Flamers, are pretty mid-tier. There seems to be an issue with their targeting, where they sort of shoot over the top of other enemy units, making them dish out a surprisingly small amount of damage. The Exalted Flamer is good at taking out single entities, but it's very fragile, and also takes 2 turns to recruit, so I don't really bother with them. Just get Changebringers instead. They have far more mobility, and they only take 1 turn to recruit. If you don't have the Shadows of Change DLC to use Changebringers, then
jog on.
A mixture of blue horrors and pink horrors are really good though. Blues at the front, pinks in the back. The trouble with these units is, firstly, range units seem to have difficulty targeting at the moment. At this point, this kind of issue has come back and forth so many times now I don't think it'll ever be fixed. And 2, they barely have any armor-piercing damage, so these units will fall off harder than my shits in winter in the late game. By then, you should have Chosen on the field with a small pack of pink horrors for fire support. The AI will tend to spam its high-tier units a lot more in the late game, so pinks and blues will have a rough time. They just lack the stopping power to bring things down fast enough, and I find their bolts are very slow moving, so things can easily avoid them. They're very good for their Arcane Mirth ability, which allows you to generate more winds of magic from them, and in the early game they're fantastic. Spam these guys out as a cost-effective firing line. Now, in terms of your single entity units, the clear winner in my opinion is the Lord of Change. It has solid melee stats and can be equipped with multiple free-to-cast spells as you progress down your technology tree. Mutalith Vortex Beasts are just bad units these days since they lost their anti-large specialisation, and Soul Grinders of Tzeentch are pretty mediocre too. My advice is to just focus on Lords of Change as your single entity late game units. Chapter 7. Teleportation Troubles. I'd be remiss for not mentioning this, as it's something I entirely neglected in my first video, and that's the teleportation stance. This was mentioned by this lovely commenter here, specifically that it isn't just an underway stance with fancy graphics. It guarantees you an ambush on any enemy army. It's pretty neat. You get a guaranteed ambush, but it halves the magic in the area, so this will impact your growth and economy buildings, whilst also making you a fair bit weaker on the battlefield. But even then, it is certainly useful at evening the odds against forces which are a bit stronger than you. You can't move after you've teleported until your next turn, but you can still reinforce battles, so it's a good way of jumping into tricky situations, killing one army in a doom blob, then having another army to follow up and support. Make sure to focus on getting the technology which makes this stance free, because you'll want to be using this a lot, especially against ranged heavy factions like Cathay and the Dwarfs. Before you have this technology, you should be using this stance sparingly. But once you have this technology, you can go nuts. But do bear in mind that it does remove all of your movement, so that army will be stuck there until the next turn. It also won't be able to follow up with an attack on any survivors unless you have another army in reinforcement range. Chapter 8. Changing of the Ways Changes. The changings of the ways are all pretty useful now. I don't think there's any trap ones as there were back when Tzeentch launched. There's still some absurdly expensive ones, like trying to break some alliances. Forcing peace can sometimes be a waste. I've literally had enemies redeclare war on me the next turn. Force war is hilarious though. I had this huge wood elf and dwarf doom blob descending on me. I forced war on them and they annihilated each other. It truly was excellent. Borrow time is fantastic. You get to replenish your army's movement points fully, so you can teleport onto one army and then follow up with another attack should you choose to. Halt faction is now just halt an army, which is a pretty big nerf, but a fair one I think. Fighting against Tzeentch as the player was just absurd with that ability getting spammed on you. Make sure to pick up Kairos' blue line skills to reduce the grimoire cost and cooldown of using the Changing of the Ways. Also, be sure to get the relevant technologies for whichever Changing of the Ways you want to invest in. Chapter 9 Conclusions. Kairos is still, without a doubt, one of the roughest campaigns. All your good units are very far down the tech tree, and you have to make do with horrors for most of your campaign. Kairos' faction is all about time. Your economy sucks to begin with, but when you start massing your multipliers together and getting enough territory, you'll start making a lot of money. But again, this is in the future. You have a heap of enemies to deal with early on and no natural allies to rely upon. Your start is hard, no doubt about it. This is not a beginner-friendly campaign. But follow these tips and you'll get that achievement. I have the utmost faith in you. You're like a big, fat, juicy caterpillar. Everyone wants to feast on you, but given enough time, you'll metamorphosize into the radiant butterfly of change which you were always destined to be. So that's why you still suck with Tzeentch. I want to give a massive shout out to my Patreon supporters: D, Joshua Krager, Paugus, Dinkle250, HunterX2, Robert Diorio, Gonk, Little Horus, Hotoris Kuz, Bongos McDongos, and this curious specimen, Draconio, who joined, dropped a $100 bomb, and then subsequently left. Absolute power play. Thank you so much. I've been Blake, delivering my take. Thank you all so much for watching.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.